Ladies and gentlemen, how you doing tonight? Okay, you can keep eating. We just ask you, we're doing an accuracy in academia authors night in the round here, as it were. And before I go on any further, I've got to say, this evening and all of our lecture series are brought to you by a grant, a very generous one from the Fusco Foundation, for which we thank them very profusely. Go ahead and sit down and make yourself comfortable. We do these and we bring the speakers to you that we do because we get to read so much of what you get to study. And we know there's a lot of information that you're just not getting, a lot of speakers you wouldn't otherwise hear, so we're trying to give you the other side here and another side of the world you may not have seen. We try to feature speakers you wouldn't normally get, not just on the college lecture circuit, but even on public affairs TV programs, not as often as you should. And in that connection comes tonight's speaker. This is, if you've read no other book on the Reagan administration, read this one. This is the book Edmund Morris should have written and didn't. Oh, you've suffered through that, did you? Okay. That's all right. Okay. Lately, we've been hearing a lot of people tell us that it's time to move beyond Reagan. It's time to forget Reagan. Well, due to our contrary nature, we figured maybe this is a good reason alone for remembering. And there's about 600 pages of good reasons for remembering him in this book. It is just incredible. I want to just share, when they tell you the times have changed, Reagan was a man of the times, let me just share these two sentences from the book. This is just rich. Okay. By 1980, many Republicans in Washington could be considered victims of the political equivalent of the Stockholm Syndrome, in which hostages come to sympathize with their captors. Having been in the minority for so long, many Washington Republicans had come to absorb the premises of establishment liberalism, preferring to offer a low-budget version of the Democratic platform. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, the times they are changing. Our speaker is just good as a biographer of this, the second volume of his series on Reagan, and also as the founder of a wonderful series, the Index of Environmental Indicators. He knew long before Al Gore did that there was no global warming. In fact, he still does. We are happy to bring to you tonight another old friend of AIA's and of Accuracy in Media's, a great guy, a great scholar, a great writer, Steve Hayward.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mal. It's always fun to come to these AIA events here at Armand's because it gives me an excuse to have pizza, which I can't really have at my age. And it's always a fun crowd. The theater and around will be a little challenging, but we'll try and cope with it a bit. Yeah, it's funny you would pick that particular a passage to read because it does sound so familiar. Most of you here, not everybody, I see an old graybeard like Bob Hubert, he's as old as I am, but most of you here don't remember the 70s. So you don't remember inflation, lining up for gasoline. You don't remember a young, new president with a thin record who thought you could reason with the rulers of Iran. Oh wait, that's the current guy, isn't it? You don't remember a young president with a thin record who thought he could control hospital costs by expanding federal bureaucracy. Oh wait, that's this guy too. You could go on in this vein, right? President Carter was heedless about monetary growth until inflation got out of control. Hopefully we won't have to go through that again, but we might, from all signs at the moment. And I suppose that means that maybe we are setting things up for another Reaganite explosion at the polls here in 3 years. The results the other night are certainly encouraging in that respect. Anyway, Mal happened to mention that he thinks I've written the book that Edmund Morris should have written. I don't know if you know the Edmund Morris story. He was this British colonial, really, not an American, that Reagan's PR people thought would be the right person to be his official biographer. And I happened to have dinner with him one night in the summer of 1993. very early in the process. And it was clear to me then that although he's a talented man, his book was going to be unsatisfying. I didn't think it would be insane. I just thought it would be too narrowly focused on Reagan's personality, which, though interesting, is less important than his political impact. And Morris is not interested in politics. So I set out to write a sort of a larger scale book that put Reagan in a broader political backdrop. And I thought this would be essential because when Reagan left office a little over 20 years ago now, I was pretty sure, as I put it earlier in the book, that he was going to be Coolidgeized instead of eulogized. By that I mean Reagan can be compared to Calvin Coolidge, a person he admired, who left office in 1929, quite popular with the American people, but after a generation of rough handling by liberal historians had been made something of a laughingstock. And it was pretty clear when Reagan left office that most of the journalists held him in low regard, and all the professors in academia held him in low regard. And I thought Reagan's going to get roughed up pretty badly and will need a defense. And I think that remains true, except something odd and unexpected happened over the last 10 years that completely surprised me. And that was that liberals started to like Reagan. Some liberals did. But it was not all of Reagan. It was only part of Reagan. Reagan's most famous movie line and a topic of his early autobiography is, "Where's the rest of me?" Well, this book tells the rest of him. Because what the liberals do is they say, well, gosh, he was really a more interesting guy than we understood. Turns out we learned starting 10 years ago that Reagan wrote a whole lot more than people thought. People used to think everything was ghostwritten for him, and then we discovered his handwritten manuscripts, thousands of pages of them, and realized that he wrote all his radio addresses, wrote a lot of his speeches. Even in the White House, he wrote major passages of his most important speeches. But then also liberals, a few of them, as I say, people like even Sean Mullentz at Princeton, Richard Reeves, who always hated Reagan until recently, started recognizing Reagan's role in the end of the Cold War as we got more and more access to documents here and some Soviet documents. Although they tended to abstract Reagan from his ideology. They tried to make him into a proto-liberal. They tried to say that, well, there was the Reagan of the first term, the Reagan who gave the famous evil empire speech that upset liberals here and everywhere. And then they say, oh, the Reagan of the second term was a man of détente and a man of peace, who swooned before Mikhail Gorbachev, which it turns out none of that is correct. It was the same Reagan from beginning to end, and I'll go through that a little bit. But the other thing is that most of the books about Reagan, including some of the really good books by conservatives and supporters of Reagan, tend to neglect his domestic policy story. The Cold War story is so very dramatic and obviously very important. Next Monday is the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the domestic policy story is a lot harder to tell than the foreign policy story. It's more diffuse. It covers a wider range of issues. The report card is more mixed. Reagan had some wins, he had some losses, he had some ties. There's a lot of issues that are still with us today. And it involves a lot of wonky detail. I mean, I'd spend a couple of pages trying to tell in a hopefully interesting way the important changes the Reagan administration made in how we regulate antitrust policy, an antitrust law in this country. But above all, the domestic policy story doesn't have as much of the same human drama as the Cold War story does. Or as I put it early in the book, Reagan never stood in front of the Federal Trade Commission and said, "Mr. Regulator, tear down this rule." Although he did have that attitude. I tell a couple stories in the book of his closed-door meetings with House Speaker Tip O'Neill, the top Democrat in town, where Reagan used some salty language that would have made Lyndon Johnson proud. A few highlights, and then I actually find it's more fun to go to questions, and I sort of want to learn a little bit more about you all and what you study and where you're working and stuff like that. One important thing that needed to be done when looking at the way the liberals were trying to present a distorted picture of Reagan was, as I put it, try to restore the unity of his statecraft. Well, what does that mean? As I say, the liberals try and say there was this foreign policy Reagan who was pretty good, and then the domestic policy Reagan who was horrible. We hated his tax cuts for the rich. We hated his civil rights policy. We hated everything else he did. And the Iran-Contra scandal was a big disaster. And so they try and separate Reagan into two different people. And I argue that you can't do that. Reagan had a central idea. And in one sentence I summarize it this way. Reagan's central idea was that unlimited government is a threat to individual liberty, both in its vicious forms, like communist totalitarianism, but also in its supposedly benign forms like big government bureaucracy, what we have here in this country. And he explained it that way in almost exactly those terms several times during his career. I think his most famous expression of this was the speech he gave in London, in Westminster Hall, to the assembled House of Lords and House of Commons in England in 1982. This was the speech that was famous because it was there, he said, it was going to be Marxism-Leninism that would end up on the ash heap of history, stealing a phrase from Lenin and turning it around on him. The speech really upset the Soviet Union. But along the way in that speech, he said, essentially said there's a continuum. We know from history and experience that centralized government power is a threat to liberty. Secret police, he said, mindless bureaucracy, all combined to stifle individual creativity. You see, he put secret police and mindless bureaucracy together in the same sentence. Secret police is the dominant feature of totalitarian governments. Mindless bureaucracy is the dominant feature of our government. And although our mindless bureaucracy may not have secret police, it may not have re-education camps yet. You never know what Glenn Beck might be right about these things. We don't have them yet. Nonetheless, the American bureaucracy these days does govern us as though we were a one-party state. In that respect, we resemble the old Soviet Union more than might be apparent on the surface, as a sort of serious matter. Reagan, I should add, understood this in constitutional terms. In a private letter he wrote in 1979, he said, the scope and scale of modern administrative government, as he rightly called it, has in effect repealed parts of our Constitution. So he thought this was, we corrupted the Constitution, and this was an important point of his. And that really permeated a lot of his thought. I'll come back to that to close in a minute, but I'll just say one thing about foreign policy. Reagan was unusual in this respect. Remember the most famous line that Margaret Thatcher said about Reagan in the 1990s? She said, Reagan won the Cold War without the firing of a single shot. And remember, we called her the Iron Lady, right? And it got me thinking once that if you go back to 1946, the Cold War more or less is announced, you might say, in Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, in the presence of Harry Truman. And it's there Churchill lays out, for the first time, an argument that then was permeated his books, that World War II was the unnecessary war. It could have been prevented, he said, without the firing of a single shot, if only we'd armed ourselves sufficiently, and then were diplomatically resolved to stand up to the dictators. So remember, what was Reagan's slogan? Peace through strength. So when the Iron Lady said that Reagan won the Cold War without the firing of a single shot, I think the Iron Lady was consciously recalling the Iron Curtain speech. Reagan, it turned out, quoted Churchill more often than every other American president combined. I did a word search on this, which you can do these days on computer text databases. And it was pretty clear that his strategy was, we're going to build up our arsenal, and then we're going to be tough in negotiations with the Soviet Union. We're having a whole new strategy for how we're going to deal with them. And that involved, as Reagan put it, calling them names, essentially, telling them what we really thought about them, and not treating them like they're a legitimate grown-up nation. It really upset and offended the Soviets, who did have a sense of inferiority, and did want to be treated like they were Germany or France, when instead they were a bunch of thugs, and worse, right? In the second term, Reagan did understand that Gorbachev and his circle had reformist instincts. He had good intelligence about this, and also good instincts about this. Reagan understood the Soviet Union was weak. He used to love to tell Gorbachev all the anti-Soviet jokes that he had people collect for him, that people told. So one of the ways to keep Gorbachev off balance is say, oh, Mr. General Secretary, I heard a new joke from your country the other day. Here's one he told him. He says, there's two guys on a long line to buy bread. That was the salient feature of the Soviet Union, was having to line up for stuff, right? And one guy says to the other, I am fed up with these long lines. I'm going to go shoot Gorbachev. 10 minutes later, the guy's back in line, and his first friend says, what happened? He says, well, the line to shoot Gorbachev was even longer than this one. So Reagan tells jokes like this to Gorbachev, which surely had to annoy the hell out of him. And then, he could be nice, and that's all, The problem with Gorbachev is liberals want to make him the hero of the Cold War story. And although he does deserve some credit for being different from the previous octogenarian bureaucrats who ran the country, like Brezhnev and so forth, After spending a lot more time than I thought I would reviewing Soviet documents, I came to the conclusion that despite Gorbachev's reformist inclinations, that were even, you might even say, liberal in the right sense of the word in some senses, he was a deeply confused reformer. He thought the problems of socialism required more socialism, which is obviously idiotic. And in fact, after he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, a reporter said, "So you're moving to the right?" And Gorbachev admitted, "Frankly, I think I'm going in circles." Which is about right. So, that being said, Reagan had real instincts about this that are quite interesting, and I go into great detail about this and recount some of their meetings I had, some of the secret intelligence reports that went back and forth, and so on. Finally, where are we today? Mal mentioned that we have far too many people say, let's move beyond Reagan. And I think there's a couple of mistakes with this idea. One is I think that part of the motivation for this are people who think they can't measure up to Reagan because they're not as good as he is as a speaker. You know, I mean, it's true, Reagan was a movie star. He was very photogenic. It was almost impossible to take a bad picture of him. And, you know, most politicians are like most ordinary Americans. They're sort of ordinary looking, right? And Reagan had that great voice and that acting background and radio training. But in fact, Reagan cultivated all of that through very hard work. He didn't come naturally to be a great speaker. He worked really, really hard at it. We now know this from, as I say, reviewing his own documents and knowing more and more about how he prepared to give speeches and the structure of the speeches. So, although someone might not be as great a communicator as Reagan, I think all people in public life can be a whole lot better than they are. They're just lazy. They don't work at it very hard. The second thing is I think people don't understand or don't appreciate Reagan's insights. Insights that are timeless, I think. I mentioned that Reagan thought about our problems in constitutional terms. There has been, over the last couple of weeks, a few people, including even a couple of reporters, one who asked Speaker Pelosi yesterday, what's the constitutional authority for requiring that American citizens have to buy health insurance? And she just laughed and said, you must be kidding. About the Constitution? I mean, it shows you how casual liberals are these days about the Constitution. I sometimes like to joke that our government, our Constitution may not be perfect, but it's better than the government we've got. Anyway, Reagan talked about the founding of America, the founding fathers more often also than most recent presidents put together. And in his second term, Reagan was frustrated by more than anything else the large federal budget deficit. Now, for comparison terms, the worst federal budget deficit under Reagan in 1983 was about 6% of gross domestic product. At that time, that was the highest peacetime deficit ever, and it scared the hell out of people. This year, we're going to be somewhere around 12 to 14% of GDP, and the proportions are going to stay at that number for the next decade. That's even if the projections are right for healthcare and other things they want to spend money on. I'm sure they're not right, so it's probably worse than that. In the second term, the deficit was still very large. The economy was booming, so it was shrinking as a proportion of GDP. It was less harmful to the economy. But still, Reagan was disappointed that he was not more effective in controlling government spending and therefore the growth of government. So, starting in 1987, Reagan began a series of speeches and repeated radio addresses. Because remember, Reagan used to like to say that if something's worth saying once, it's worth saying over and over again. Because he understood as a good marketing pitchman that repetition is the key to getting your message across. So starting in 1987, he advocated for what he called the Economic Bill of Rights. This again is a nice little bit of thievery, because that was the phrase Franklin Roosevelt used in 1944 for saying we ought to have an economic bill of rights that was nationalized health care, right to a government-provided job, and other really bad ideas, right? So Reagan's economic bill of rights was just the opposite. He said, we have constitutional problems, we need a constitutional remedy. And he proposed 5 amendments. The first 2 are ones he'd always talked about. A balanced budget amendment, and a line item veto for the president, so a president could, knock out these earmarks and pork barrel spending and the kind of things that lard up the federal budget today and so rightly anger citizens. And of course, Congress wasn't about to give on either one of those. But then he had 3 others that he had not talked about before, although they were ideas he had tried to implement in California as governor in the 70s. One was a 2/3 vote requirement for tax increases. The next one was a constitutional spending limit. In other words, let's find a number. He didn't specify it. In California, he wanted to be 7.62% of state income in Prop 1 in 1973. On the federal level, he said, we need to think about what it should be, but there should be a limit. probably what would make sense would be around 20% of GDP would make a sensible limit for reasons we could go into in a technical sense. And that would be the most that the federal government could spend of our national income. And the third one he suggested is the one to me that shows how far-sighted Reagan was. I know that some of our favorite talk show hosts, Mark Levin, Sean Hannity, like to quote Reagan saying that freedom is only one generation away from being lost. And this is the sunny optimist, right? But he's always worried about this, because each generation needs to understand it. So his last amendment was a constitutional ban on wage and price controls. Now this is really interesting for several reasons. One is, under an older understanding of the Constitution, say that as it was interpreted 100 years ago, wage and price controls would have been presumptively unconstitutional under any number of clauses in the original Constitution. But that's all been stripped away by the courts and modern liberalism. So Reagan said we need to write it in black and white in the Constitution. The other thing that's interesting about it is in the late 1980s, nobody was talking about bringing back wage and price controls. We tried them in the 70s. They were a dismal failure. And there wasn't anybody anywhere saying we ought to try that again. And there was not much inflation then, so we weren't worried about price controls. But where are we today? We are controlling the wages of bankers. And just the other day, Mr. Feinberg said he wants more authority to control wages in the corporate sector of the economy, even presumably for companies that aren't now half owned by the taxpayer. And we are about to, perhaps, move into a new world where we're controlling all of the prices of the entire health sector instead of controlling about half the prices as we do now through Medicare and Medicaid and other things that we've got in place. And you can see that if any of those amendments were in place today, you can see how the Obama agenda would be stopped in its tracks. Now, it's difficult to amend the Constitution, but I like to argue that it's not always necessary to get an amendment passed to change the politics of the country. And I think the best example in modern times comes from the left. For 20 years or more, the chief object of the feminist movement was the Equal Rights Amendment, which died in the States. And yet, most of what feminists want, they have gotten because of the political force behind the feminist movement. And it seems to me that one thing I've been saying for several months now is that one thing the Tea Party movement might want to think about, and other leading political figures, is adopt what I call Reagan's unfinished agenda. Let's bring those amendments back up and talk about them. If nothing else, it makes the liberals respond and why it's a bad idea and puts them on the defensive for this program of what I call government gigantism that's going on these days. So those are a few opening thoughts. I will sort of stop talking now and we'll move to questions, which is always more fun. But before I do that, let me, most of you are students, right? How many of you are political science majors or history majors? Right, about half of you or so. Are any of you pre-law? Maybe a couple of you? Yeah. Some of you old guys.
He goes, the rest of you will have jobs.
Right? How many of you are working in internships on the Hill? At about a third of you. And then what? The rest of you are working in what? Not Hill things, I suppose, right? Okay. Well, at this point, I'll throw it open to questions or comments and can fill in a few gaps or whatever we want to do. No one ever wants to ask the first question. Always have. So you do. You're twitching. No?
Okay. Yeah, it's popular to kind of invoke Reagan as what would Jesus do? What would Reagan do for the conservative movement? What do you think his position would be on immigration? Because I see that as like the people out there today, it was predominated by a Southern accented congressman, where immigration is seen as an evil, but I think the Democrats are really going to steal our thunder and steal a lot of votes from the burgeoning Hispanic population.
Yeah, they already are.
But Hispanics are conservative. They could be conservative, especially on life issues. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, the question was, it was on Reagan and immigration. Reagan pushed through I shouldn't say pushed through. He signed and largely supported an immigration reform bill in 1986 that essentially, they didn't mean it to be amnesty. At that time we thought we had 1 million illegal immigrants in the country. Now we think we have, what, 15 or 20 million? We're not even sure. They didn't intend it to be amnesty, but that's what it ended up being, because it had employer verification requirements that sort of fell in abeyance. But once again, Reagan was unique on this issue. What he talked about, he talked about the aspect of citizenship, about how people can come to America from anywhere and become Americans. I mean, by adopting the country's principles. See, in the same way that you can't move to France and become a Frenchman. I mean, you might be able to get a French citizenship, although it's not easy, I don't think. But, you know, it's sort of a cultural thing and it's almost like a birthright thing, right? You can't move to many countries and become, you know, identify with that country in the same way you can come to America and become an American. So the problem, I think one of the things they'd say is the problem with immigration today is that we're no longer oriented to making citizens out of people who come here. That's a whole side, it's a whole separate from the question of how many and the social services question, which is a serious one. That's the second thing I think Reagan would say is, you know, Milton Friedman, who, you know, was very close to Reagan, used to say, and this is you know, an issue here in the healthcare debate, you cannot have a welfare state and high rates of immigration. So you choose. I mean, you know, the European countries, if they had the same rates of immigration that we do, illegal immigration, their welfare states would collapse overnight. And ours is under tremendous strain. You know, California, I think, you know, I forget what the number is, but California is $20 billion underwater, and probably $5 billion of that is cost of illegal immigrants. So there's an economic problem. So I think the liberal line on this, and there's more parts to it than this, but I think the liberal line on this is vulnerable on those two matters, because liberals always want to stress multiculturalism. You know, essentially they're saying, come here, but don't become an American. And then secondly, this puts pressure against their welfare state. So we'll see. Right now, by the way, I think immigration is, illegal immigration is ground to a halt because of the economy. And there may even be a reverse flow of people right now, although we never quite know because the numbers on this are always a little squishy. Someone else? Bob. Okay, and then, yeah. Be a traffic cop for me. Yeah.
Steve, as you will recall, in the late 70s, there was a certain symbiotic relationship between the conservative movement and the conservative youth movement and the Reagan administration. He was governor of California and running for president. How would you see the prospects for that now? He's not a candidate, but